afternoon, we're going to be talking first about
background,
and then
structure,
and then the third thing we're going to be talking about is the overview of each standard, kind of a preview for what you're going to be doing, breaking out in the groups after this, with an emphasis on the context of this first big essential element, the world in spatial terms. And I have to say that where I live in Texas, the word spatial has two meanings. One is special, the way most of us would say it, and the rest of us would say it spatial, because everything spatial is spatial in Texas. So we'll just go with that. So to begin with, in terms of background, the first iteration of the National Geography Standards came out of this kind of mid-1980s fear that our education system was disintegrating. You know, it was the time of all of this kind of angst about the quality of American education. So the National Governors Association got engaged. There was high-level summits that brought together the idea that what we needed were standards. And the National Council for Teachers of Mathematics, NCTM, were the first people to develop standards. And then after that, we received lots of support at the federal level for developing standards. There were standards in history and geography, civics, and these were large-scale projects funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, by the U.S. Department of Education to develop these standards. It was a very large process. It was a consensus process. We had an international committee, we had teacher committees, we had content experts, and basically, though it was written, this was written by 6 people. Dick Boehm and I were part of the group that did the K4 standards. There was a separate group that did the 5-8 standards, and again, a separate group that did the 9-12 standards. There was really no articulation across each of these sets of standards, but we had 18 standards in total, but it was very much a separate K4, 5-8, 9-12 document. These were launched in 1994 to a tremendous uproar of controversy about history. So the history standards, surprise, surprise, once again, were very controversial, and geography standards were launched at the same time in kind of a low-key basis, because we didn't want to get caught up in this maelstrom of angst about the history. So it was a relatively slow rollout. There was not a lot of funding to support any kind of implementation of the standards. But over a period of time, it's interesting to see how those 1994 National Geography Standards became incorporated into state standards all across the nation. The second standards began in 2008. We knew we had to have a revision. Lots of stuff had changed, not only geospatial technologies, but kind of conceptualizations of what geography is all about. This time we did it with no external funding, but GENIP, the Geography Education National Implementation Project, had been very clever about taking some of the money from the sale of the 1994 standards and sequestering it for an ultimate revision. So we used that funding. There were many layers of checking, but we had some major innovations. One of them was that we had consistent writing teams. So instead of having a separate K4, 5-8, 9-12 groups, this time we had one team that did 3 standards, grades 4, grades 8, grades 12, so that we could really kind of begin this idea of working across grade levels and developing sophistication and progression. We did have content reviewers. We had lots of teachers involved in review, and this time we added reviewers with expertise in the learning sciences. So we were beginning to understand that this relationship of learning and research was very important to the standards. And we were able to update the standards, paying close attention to, if you read the document carefully, what we called the intellectual skills of thinking geographically. And one other important innovation is that we used 7 verbs, only 7 verbs, consistently across the document. And they're defined in the standards, so as a way to kind of try to regularize what we were doing. Okay, so 1994, 2012. The structure of the standards. if you look at the document, you have some of the pages in your handbook. You can see at the top of the page what we have are these things that are called elements. So the world in spatial terms is the one big element. And then there's a standard summary that comes after that. And then there are colored grade bands showing how themes in this essential element, the standard, develop consistently across the standard. So, for example, the theme here is properties and functions of geographic representation. So that's the theme for this particular chunk of this particular standard, and that's across the grade levels. Then across this, then next you have what are called knowledge statements. And the knowledge statements are really what students know and understand after completing a particular grade band. Following that, we have the performance standards. What is the student able to do on the basis of that knowledge, so as you work your way down. And then, finally, underneath that, we have examples of learning opportunities. And the idea here is that these are nuggets of ideas for things a teacher might do to elicit the kind of performance that we want. So we're trying to have this kind of hierarchical system going from the knowledge statement to the performance statement to some ideas of what it really means in practice to see whether a student can do these kinds of things. So the structure is a little complex, not as complex as some of the other standards I've seen lately, but it does lay out for you in this particular way. Okay, so as I said, as you read the standards, as you work in your groups, pay attention to those introductory essays. They really do contain a lot of ideas that then is kind of like an advanced organizer for what you're going into and looking at in the standards. But for our work here today, this weekend, we're looking at standards 1, 2, and 3, the whole idea of the world in spatial terms. Now, do you know who this is? The geographer. Vermeer's The Geographer. And so what we're really trying to get at here is, I mean, he's looking out the window, he's thinking about the world, and that is the essence of this particular standard. It's thinking about the world spatially, looking out the window in terms of kind of having some idea of the essence of geography, which is asking and answering the question, where? So if you think in terms of back to the kind of classic geography ideas about the morphological eye, having this kind of geographic bent of being able to just to think geographically and want to know about where things are and why they are where they are, that is what this essential element is all about. So it's really the structuring of geographic information, it's the ordering of that geographic information into mental maps, and it's the spatial analysis of geographic information. That's what this hunk of stuff is, this chunk, I guess. So as we look at these standards in some depth, the first standard is using maps and other geographic representations, geospatial technologies, and spatial thinking, so we loaded it up, to understand and communicate information. This was one of the standards that we really radically changed from the 1994 to the 2012 version because we had to add geospatial technologies and we had to emphasize spatial thinking. It just seemed the right thing to do at this point. So in essence, you can see underneath that there are 3 big ideas, and what those big ideas really come out to is, in simple terms, we want students to read maps, to be able to make maps, and to be able to use maps. That's what the essence of that first standard is. And so as you look at this then, as you move from K8 to K4 to 5.8 to 9.12, we see a progression across each of these themes. I hope we see that. And I think that this one is really significant because maps are having a moment right now. Facebook, CityLab, you can't go anywhere now without seeing maps, maps, maps. So here's one I just picked up recently. This is the geography of college football fandom. You can kind of argue about this, but this is the kind of geographic representation that's floating out in the public now. And people are sending them to each other, and they're talking about them, and they're discussing them. There's something wrong with the algorithm. The attention for Texas A&M is much larger than is represented on this. I contacted them and told them that. But anyway, so it's not all that orange. So this is, here's another one that's also been floating around. So here's the geography of NFL fandom. And again, this is the kind of thing that people are talking about at the, over the water fountain, if there are still water fountains, or the self-fill bottle thingies that are in other places now. So the people are just thinking spatially more than they ever have before. Or maybe some of you are familiar with floatingsheep.org, which is a group of kind of radical cartography geographers. And this is tweeting about beer versus tweeting about church. And for those of you who have any kind of understanding of the geography and the spatial characteristics of this country, you can see the Bible Belt just jumps out at you. And again, so these are using social media as a source for information about things that are happening very quickly. Or the maps that have been coming out of the University of Michigan looking at the election results. So you can see red states, blue states, and then they even have maps where they kind of gradate the counties with split with kind of a purple color. But again, I mean, it discourages me as a Democrat to look at this picture, but then it encourages me to think that the Democrat won, and then why? You know, just all these kinds of things. And so it's not only just these kind of social things. Here's a map showing migrating ocean pollution. So people are really visualizing a lot these days, and it's becoming much, much more important. Standard 2 is all about mental maps. So understanding, look at the cartoon, yes. So understanding, I mean, all those maps we were just looking at are meaningless unless you have some sense of an organized understanding of where things are in the world. And yes, the standard joke is in this country, usually it's wars that cause us Americans to learn geography, but in fact, even things like the Scottish referendum, well, I think it's just because people saw Braveheart and they care. But, and so here we have the whole idea of organizing mental understanding, developing mental maps, using those mental maps, and then the very important point that perception plays a role in the development of these mental maps as well. And so some of you might know this kind of classic cartoon from the New Yorker. You have the outer towner who is totally lost, who has no mental understanding of where he is in the city, and he's asking directions from the policeman who has a very well-ordered mental understanding. And so our definition of mental maps is this idea of an individual's internalized representation of aspects of Earth's surface. And so Standard 2 is all about learning place location. Now, I know that some people don't think that this is all that important, but I strongly believe that this is what the American public believes that we should, as geographers, be concerned about. And I know that because every time I sit next to somebody on an airplane and they ask me who I am, what I do, then they try to play stump the geographer by asking me esoteric place location kinds of things. I always know the right answers, too. But then the role of perception is very important. This is another great map. This is the perception of Manhattan from the City Lab. You can take a lot of time and look at this, but they literally collected information from a large number of people about the perceptions of different parts of greater New York, and this is what Great Dumplings is where I want to go, but it's too close to the weird fish smell. So again, your mental map is a mix of the subjective knowledge and subjective perception. That's something we're going to have to grapple with. And then finally we have Standard 3, which is all about the analysis of spatial organization of people, places, and environments. And people, places, and environments is our code for geography. So people don't know what geography is, but they know what people, places, and environments are. So that's what we do. And so here the big ideas are spatial concepts, spatial patterns and processes, and then spatial models. So you go back to Abler, Adams, and Gould, the classic blue book, Dr. Harrington. This comes straight out of that tradition. So that when you look at a map, this is actually a map, it's not actually a satellite image, I've come to understand. You can look at this and you begin to apply your spatial concepts, you see clusters, you see patterns, you begin to ask and answer questions. Well, why do you have all these things happening? What is going on out there in Iowa? What is that big line of, all these questions that you can ask from looking at this if you're a geographically informed person. But then, again, this is just an observation kind of thing, because then you have to then understand what are the models that are driving some of these processes. And yes, I have my Central Place hexagon scarf on today, but this is an illustration of Central Place theory. And then, so understanding the patterns, looking at the models that are driving these patterns or are somewhat related to these patterns in some cases, and then coming back and again saying, okay, we see the patterns, but what are the processes that are driving these kinds of patterns? So this is a map of poverty, persistent poverty, so you have to then apply your understanding of the patterns, of the processes, and the models to be able to fully understand all of these kinds of relationships. So that's what Standard 3 is about. That's what all of these things are about. Maps, representations, geographic information, and understanding something about them. So this is my last map. I don't know if you've seen this. Is and I don't know if it's true or not. I want to know, where do they say I guess people don't. But again, the idea of spatializing everything. That's what this first essential element is about. So, any thoughts or questions? Yes, ma'am.
How can we capitalize on the Nobel Prize winners in medicine? Who are looking at the spatial, that's really something that people pay attention to.
We should have capitalized more on Paul Krugman's award, because what Krugman is doing is much more akin to actually this kind of spatial patterns and processes in his economic geography research. But yeah, we should actually say that we care about where things are, and so we are making the next step in terms of understanding that there are these cells in our brain that help us to understand location. But we all wear little fMRIs on our head or something like that, I don't know.
Well, and part of that is the follow-on discussion there, and again, that if we're trying, at least some of us are thinking about the public engagement of people in terms of geography, and there it's the issue of the Alzheimer's patients who lose their way, and they're starting to say, oh, this might be able to help them in some research. So just, again, it's not really what we're doing here, but as we're thinking about it and we're talking to other people in the community or the scientific community, let's use that.
Well, all these adaptive technologies that can be used to compensate people who have some kinds of disabilities is really a powerful research area.